This session is From Labour Zionism to the Religious Right, Has Israel Changed? My name is Agnese. I'm a member of the Hackney branch of the Socialist Workers' Party, and I will be chairing this session. Before I introduce our speaker today, just a few words on how the meeting runs. Our speaker will introduce the topic for about 30 minutes. After that, we will have a very short icebreaker, and then I will be taking questions and contributions. I have then just a couple of announcements, and then our speaker is going to sum up. Right, so our speaker today is Rob Ferguson. He's a member of the Socialist Workers' Party in Dorset. He's also a member of the National Steering Committee of Stop the War, and he's written extensively on Israel and Palestine in the International Socialism Journal and also in Socialist Worker. So without further ado, Rob, if you want to start.
Okay, so the title of the meeting, Has Israel Changed? Well, I'm glad there's a lot of you here. If you want the spoiler and leave, the answer is no. Wait for it. And yes, it has. Both. The question's an important one. I want to argue for three reasons. One, the political trajectory of the Zionist project, I think, points to the nature of its foundations. Secondly, it helps inform what and who we are fighting. Let me just do my time as well. What and who we are fighting in the battle for Palestinian freedom. And thirdly, that understanding that political trajectory points to the forces that can end the genocide and the settler colonial project from which that generates it. There are two approaches, I guess, to the question of the title that I wish to contest. The main one is that of liberal supporters of Israel who contend that the current Israeli regime led by Netanyahu and the religious right represents a break from supposedly democratic or even socialist principles of Israel's founders. The other, an understandable view in present circumstances, but I think mistaken, is that the genocide in Gaza simply reflects the culmination of a long-held intention on the part of the Zionist leadership to rid Greater Israel, Eretz Israel, of every single Palestinian. What I think this view misses, and which I want to explore, are the tensions, contradictions, and indeed I would argue the crisis the Zionist project faces. So let's look at the trajectory. For the first 3 decades of Israel's existence after the Nakba, Labour Zionism dominated every government, all its state institutions, the upper echelons of the army, including all its successive chiefs of staff up until 1977 or so. In the last legislative elections to the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, in 2022, the Israeli Labour Party received less than 4% of the vote and only, I forget quite, either 3 or 4 seats. Meretz, which is the wing of Labour Zionism most associated with advocating the two-state solution, failed to get a single seat. So how do we explain the trajectory from the Labour Zionism of Israel's founders to the current dominance and hegemony of the right, not least the religious right in Netanyahu's cabinet? First, I want to outline some constant features, founding features of the Jewish state. One, it was always a colonial project. Two, it was always an imperialist project. Now, in saying that, I don't mean that this is simply a fortuitous combination. The Jewish state was rooted and forged within the imperialist world order that emerged at the end of the First World War. It owes its foundations and its continued existence to the imperialist powers. First to Britain and France, and then to the United States. Secondly, it is a project that has always faced Palestinian resistance. Resistance that poses a threat not only to the settler colonial state, but also to the imperialist order in the Middle East, and I'll explain why. Although Phil Marfleet, who is sitting in this room, has just published a book which I cannot summarise in this, which really explores this in depth, Palestine, Imperialism and the Struggle for Freedom, and I recommend that book to everyone here. Thirdly, Israel was forged and continues to exist in the context of threat of revolt by the masses of the Middle East against their own rulers. Now, in elaborating this discussion, I want to, I guess, maybe by implication, if not explicitly, contest the view of Zionism as an all-powerful ideology, almost an autonomous power, somehow able to subsume governments, states, parties, even perhaps social movements within its grip. Not only do I think this is an ahistorical view, but it is unable to explain the relationship between Israel and imperialism, and acts, I think, as an impediment to building the kind of movement we need to challenge them. So what of the origins of Zionism and Labour Zionism? Zionism emerged as a political movement in reaction to the rise of anti-Semitism in the latter part of the 19th century. The promise of emancipation and free assimilation of the late 19th century was torn aside as economic crisis, the conflict between new nation states, and crucially the rise of working class socialist and revolutionary movements wrapped the capitalist system. And Zionism as a political movement sought a solution to rising anti-Semitism and persecution and exclusion that would provide Jewry a place in the existing world order without challenging the social system on which that order was founded. If you want to read alternative movements that were more dominant at the time, people should look at the book Radical Jewish Tradition by Donnie Gluckstein and Jamie Stone. From the outset, Zionism's founders sought the support of colonial powers to grant a Jewish homeland. This required significant effort. Government ministers, military officers, political figures across Europe, but particularly in Britain, had to be systematically courted, lobbied, and persuaded that such a project would further the interests of imperialist power. By the way, this was never a moral argument about looking after the interests of Jews. But it was not ultimately Zionist power of persuasion or influence that was the crucial factor. As World War I drew to a close, the old colonial powers, particularly Britain and France, were carving up the Ottoman Empire. The newly discovered vast oil reserves of the Middle East were a prize that was to shape the fate of the region. But it was also a period of revolution and revolt. The Russian Revolution speaks for itself. Also revolutions in Germany, Hungary, Italy, and Europe. But the Middle East was far from untouched. One might refer to an Arab Spring of 1919, which saw revolts across Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, and Palestine spread into Iraq, Morocco, Sudan, and Syria. Just some news headlines from the time. Egypt, peril to the east. Rise of Bolshevism threatens to renew world warfare. And British officials in Egypt, for example, fearing that Soviets might take hold, insisted the Mufti issue a fatwa against Bolshevism. This was a protracted wave of revolt that lasted from, in the Middle East, that lasted from 1918 to the early 1930s, after which we had the Great Palestine Revolt of 36 to 39. The RAF mounted bombing campaigns against the revolts in Egypt and Iraq, and the French Air Force bombed rebels and deployed tens of thousands of French troops against the Great Syrian Revolt of 1925 and 27. So it's in this context, the post-war carve-up of the Middle East, the discovery of vast oil reserves, and the threat of Arab nationalism and revolution, that Britain throws its hand behind the Jewish homeland with the Balfour Declaration. And it was no accident, by the way, that it was Balfour who spearheaded the political opposition to Home Rule for Ireland in Britain. As the first British military governor of Jerusalem, Ronald Storrs, put it, Britain needed a little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. Why Labour Zionism? Appeals to the imperialist powers and their interests were a necessary but insufficient condition for establishing a new state. Granting of a homeland in itself was not enough. The Zionists required settlers to lay the foundations of a future state, and it was the Labour Zionists who provided a practical plan, hitherto absent, for doing it. Ideology did play a role. Jewry in Europe faced the rise of anti-Semitism and fascism on one hand, and the shutters, the iron shutters of anti-immigration controls coming down on the other. Labour Zionism had to appeal to potential support in a context where large numbers of Jews were turning to revolutionary and socialist movements. But there is a distinction between the contradictions of Zionist ideology among diaspora Jewry outside Palestine and the role of Labour Zionism in laying the foundations of the settler state. Dave Sternhell, in his book, The Founding Myths of Israel, argues rightly that the invocation of socialist principles by the Labour Zionists were simply mobilizing myths. Important, but myths nonetheless. Labour Zionism has to be understood as rooted in the forging of the institutions of state. It was the Labour Zionists who provided a plan for laying those foundations. Most important of all was what was called the Jewish Labour Union, the Histadrut. It adopted that banner, but in reality, it acted as the recruiter and organizer of settler labour in industry and agriculture to the exclusion of the Palestinians. Ben Gurion, Labour Zionism's preeminent figure at its founding and first Prime Minister, described the task of the Histadrut as the conquest of the land by the Jewish worker. And the aim was to forge a tightly controlled, autonomous Jewish economic state within the Palestinian economy and displace the latter. So the Histadrut became the linchpin of settlement. Within a year of its founding, it had set up agricultural cooperatives, banks, construction firms, and after the Nakba, after 1948, Histadrut came to dominate state industry at its height, owning 25% of Israel industry and its second largest employer after the government itself. It owned Israel's largest bank and largest shipping company and and 70% of Israelis were dependent on the Histadrut National Health Scheme. But the settler economy could not survive in coexistence with the Palestinian economy. Central to the Histadrut project was the double boycott of Arab labour and Arab produce, and the exclusion of Arab labour and the boycott of Arab produce became cornerstones of the Labour Zionist project, all in the name of the interests of the Jewish worker. But the double boycott and the exclusion of Palestinian tenant villages and so forth required more than economic institutional power. It required force. And it was the Histadrut that became the driver of the Haganah, the Zionist militia. There's no accident that the two combined. My father went to Palestine in the 30s as a socialist Zionist. He left, and the trigger for him leaving was arriving at a plantation that still employed Arab labour, and the Haganah organiser stood at the gates with a club to beat the Arab over the head, saying, "No Arabs work here." So the economic exclusion of the Palestinian population went hand in hand with military force right from the start. Golda Meir referred to the Histadrut as a colonizing agency. And Ben-Gurion himself said wrote that he doubted that without the Histadrut, the state of Israel would exist. It was, as one author describes, the executive arm of the Zionist movement. And it was in the Histadrut that Labour Zionism had its institutional power. This was also the era in which states around the globe were building up the resources of capital and industrial investment, and in many developing countries under the claim of socialist production. So the political ideology of Labour Zionism, its traction with Jewish refugees fleeing fascism and anti-Semitism in Europe, certainly strengthened its influence, but it was its role in forging the centralized institutions of economic and military power that made Labour Zionism the driving force of the Zionist project for the first 3 decades. And similarly, the same is true of the kibbutz, which again had both an economic and military function. While only 6% of the settler population, kibbutz members formed the backbone of the IDF senior command during the Nakba. This dominance continued after 1948. In 1956, during the Suez crisis, half of all fighter pilots were kibbutz members, and they led the majority of the volunteer units of the IDF, in which many had command roles. And the kibbutz were formed to stake out, prior to 1948, the territory and the boundaries of what they aimed to be the new future Jewish settler state. So the Histadrut, the kibbutz, and the Haganah militia were the strategic arms of the settler project. And although Labour Zionism was by no means the only political current prevalent amongst immigrants from Europe, Likud, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich had their predecessors in revisionist Zionism, notably a figure called Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was significant, but these forces did not have the means to deliver. Labour Zionism provided a unique ideological and organisational coherence for colonial settlement and for establishing the military and economic structures of the new state. and it was the Labour Zionists who acted as the key drivers of Palestinian dispossession. Okay, how to explain the trajectory to where we are today. First of all, the settlers themselves. Labour Zionism was founded on the back, if you like, of the settlement of Jews fleeing fascism and anti-Semitism in Europe in large part, and then the Holocaust. Subsequent waves of settlement were very different. The Mizrahi, Sephardi Jews from the countries around the Middle East and so forth. Ethiopian Jews, later some waves of Jews from America, Australia and so on, but crucially the two big major waves of Russian Jewish migration, overwhelmingly secular, by the way, non-religious, coming after. And each wave, particularly the Mizrahi Jews, found themselves relegated to the worst housing, inferior jobs, etc. This didn't lead to any sense of solidarity with the Palestinians, by the way. Quite on the contrary, we see these different constituencies of settlement, if you like, vying for the privileges of the settler colonial regime. And the beneficiaries, in part, were the right. We see in 1977 the first defeat of Labour Zionist government, replaced by Likud, led by Menachem Begin. Although himself an Ashkenazi Jew, on the back, significantly, of many Mizrahi, Middle Eastern Jewish votes. That wasn't the only factor. The 1977 election came in the wake of the 1974 Arab-Israeli war, in which, at its outset, Israel and its allies received a major shock in terms of the advance of the Arab forces and so on. Secondly, there is an economic aspect. The way in which Israel's integration into the dynamic of the world economy transformed the economic structures of the state economy. Neoliberal economics took hold in Israel as elsewhere, and the structures of the state economy, so vital to Israel's foundation, were now outlived. The Histadrut and the kibbutz were privatized and went into massive decline, especially the Histadrut. Not only did this undermine the political grip of Labour Zionism, but another dynamic was also important. Anne Alexander, in the last session, spoke of how Israel has, over decades, developed a high-tech economy fueled by US arms and so forth, and is now a centre of capital accumulation in its own right, no longer dependent on economic aid and subsidy from the US. Still vast amounts of military aid, but it used to be dependent on economic aid and subsidy. That's no longer the case. And at the same time, we have seen the relative decline of the dominance of US imperialism across the globe, particularly in the Middle East, in the face of major rivals like China, but also its ability to dictate to the rising regional powers as well. And that has created space for the Israeli ruling class to assert independence, important degrees of independence from the US and the imperialist powers. And that too has benefited the right and the settler religious right, who want to attach primacy to the war on the Palestinians, whether it's the genocide in Gaza or the onslaught in the West Bank. And to finally, well, not quite finally, but there is also the element of Israel's imperialist role in disciplining the Arab regimes when necessary, if you like. This is not simply just at the behest of the US or the imperialists. It's in Israel has a vested interest in the imperialist order, and it can act in pursuit of those interests, sometimes not absolutely aligned with the wishes of the imperialist powers. And this was true in 1956, and it was true in 1967. But we see it throughout its history. 1970, the Black September, Israel intervened to help shore up the Jordanian ruling class against revolt by Palestinians and the left in Jordan, in Lebanon, in the 1980s. And it's no accident, for example, that the biggest spike of military aid to Israel before the present was in 1979 with the fall of the Shah of Iran. And as I said, this is not a simple alignment. Israel does exert its own interest. 1967, in my view, is absolutely crucial, because the premise of the Israeli state, of the Zionist project, Abba Ibn, the prime minister at the time, described this fact as a barrel of dynamite. Another minister said, if it were up to us, we would send them all to Brazil, which tells you something, but also that they couldn't do it. Menachem Begin, interestingly, suggested that they could place the Palestinians in the occupied territories under military rule for 7 years, then grant them citizenship, which would be a problem because of the growing population, and so they would have to find more settlers to migrate and up the birth rate. So it's not quite the picture that they were driven in 1967 simply by the desire to expand. It was crucially a function of Israel's imperialist role, not that there weren't elements who did look to, expanding into a greater Israel, but there wasn't a, iron plan to simply expand. And why is this important? And this brings me to really the conclusion. Palestinian resistance. You see, the PLO was founded before 67, 1960s, but really from the 1960s through to the 1980s, Israel went to great lengths to crush the PLO. Jordan, intervention in the Lebanese civil war, and so on. It thought it had succeeded in crushing Palestinian resistance in the early 80s, only for the first intifada to break out at the end of the 1980s. And then they thought that the Oslo Accords and bringing back the Palestine Authority to discipline and manage the population would achieve their aims. Only for the second intifada to explode in the 2000s and the victory of Hamas in the 2006 elections. And then you can go through the list. The Great March of Return in Gaza. Crucially, the Unity Intifada of 2021, which united Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and crucially, Palestinians within 1948 Israel. And it's in no accident that it's in the 2022 elections the next year that we see the far-right fanatics of the religious right, like Jewish Power and Smotrich and so on, coming from the margins into the mainstream and into the cabinet. I'll finish with this. This is not just about a government, political parties, political forces. We are talking about a settler colonial regime. And the unique feature of a settler colonial regime of this type is that every settler has an investment in the dispossession of the Palestinian people. If you want to, and this is important, I think, in understanding the current genocide. A poll in May found that 82% of the Jewish settler population supported the expulsion of every Palestinian from Gaza. And the most recent poll, found in the last few days by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, found that 64% of Israelis believe there are no innocents in Gaza. And I just want to finish with this. There's an article in New Left Review by Michael Buravoy, who died tragically recently in a car accident. And he asks the question, why did South Africa not lead to the genocide that we are seeing in Gaza? And I think his very persuasive argument is that in South Africa, for all its horrors, the settler colonial regime relied on the exploitation of black labour. In Israel, the project founded by Labour Zionism, their founding principle was the exclusion of Palestinians from the territory. And that, through all the historical, economic, social developments, the crisis of imperialism in the region has led to genocide. And actually that reflects something of a crisis. Because are they going to slaughter 2 million people? What would be the consequences? I don't like to play the numbers. It's not to play down the horror of what's happened. Can they expel every Palestinian? Garda Kami spoke last night saying one lesson of 48 is that Palestinians will not leave. And so I'll finish with Buravoy's words. If in the 80s and early 90s the South African liberation movement represented the worldwide struggle against colonialism, today Palestinians represent and concentrate the global struggle against imperialist rule. The far right, the religious right, are a consequence of the project that Labour Zionism founded. We have to sweep it away and the imperialist order that underpins it. The imperialist order. So there is a material basis for the solidarity that poses a threat both to settler colonialism and the imperialist regime. The question, look, you said you were going to be a bit cheeky about the question you've been asked. I'm going to be cheeky back. You asked about the political parties. I've got an article in ISJ called Israel's Roadmap to Genocide, which explores some of that. In terms of the question about breaking the silence and other very courageous and often brave opponents of the settler colonial regime, the most principled ones, yes, it's important that we note them and highlight them. But let's be clear, that the nature of the settler colonial society is one that these forces can never command a majority or a movement to overthrow the settler colonial regime from within. And I want to come finally to Phil's important question. Maybe I skated somewhat in the time, but first to say, yes, it's true that the entirety of the Zionist political spectrum always had its aim as domination of historic Palestine from the river to the sea. But I think this is important. There's a difference between having that aim and then translated into practice, refusing to concede any territory, and then the question of how you dominate the Palestinian population. Because if you look at 1956 Suez Crisis, this was motivated primarily by the rise of the Arab nationalist regime in Egypt and the challenge to the imperialist order that posed. Yes, there was the element of expansion, but really it was the rise of Nasser that took it. That left a legacy in 1967, where again, the trigger was Nasser's decision, quite understandably, to pull back UN troops from the border. There were no UN troops on the Israeli side, just on the Egyptian side. All the discussions in the Israeli cabinet prior to the Six-Day War are really about Egypt and the Arab states, rather than the Palestinians. Afterwards, as I've described in that cabinet meeting, this is not a matter of giving up territory, no. But it is a matter of how you control the Palestinian population. And if you think about it, they tried everything. They tried the settlements. They tried the blockade. They pulled the settlements out of Gaza in 2005 because they thought they would concentrate, they adopted the strategy of expanding the settlements in the West Bank and then blockading Gaza and so forth. They tried the Oslo Accords. They tried military onslaughts. They tried to play Hamas off against the PA. And by the way, it was only not long before 7th of October that Netanyahu told the cabinet, because there was a big argument about it, we need the Palestine Authority. We need the Palestine Authority to control the Palestinian help control the Palestinian population on the West Bank. And I think all that's important because it speaks to two things. One, the permanence of Palestinian resistance and its crucial role in challenging not only the settler regime, but igniting revolt more widely across the Middle East. And two, the crisis of the Zionist project that Alex referred to in the last contribution. And that then informs us about the kind of strategy we need. And I'll finish with this, because I said last night that what gives in Ghana Kami's meeting, what gives me hope? Glastonbury. Now, you could say it's just a music festival, but the sentiments expressed by thousands of young people, mainly at that festival, resonate, I believe, amongst millions across the world. Their sentiments over the horror of the genocide, but also of the horror of the system that gives rise to it. And the measures of repression, banning, prescription, and so on, that our own state has put in place in order to attempt to suppress it. I don't think they will. But polls in support of stopping arms sales, of support for the Palestinians, not only in Britain, not only in the United States, not only amongst Jewish voters in the United States, particularly young Jews, speaks to the potential for revolt and revolution. But the potential has to be acted upon. And I'll finish with this. Look, it's great we have us all here, but we need more, because politics are important. The discussions we've had in this session lead to conclusions about how you organise and how you fight. If you like what you've heard, I would ask that you join. If you're persuaded, no, if you're only a bit persuaded, join, because it's in the battle and in the fight that we are able to put to the test how we achieve a world in which is free of oppression, of racism, of war, and where Palestine is free from the river to the sea.